Hello and welcome back to the College Football Fanatics podcast. This is episode 4 covering week 6. I'm your host, Daniel. And I just want to hop right into it for this week. There's a lot to cover. So, um, this past weekend, Georgia and Missouri played. Now, Georgia was ranked number 1 at 4-0, and Missouri was was unranked with a record of 2-2. Um, this was a really surprising game because I expected Georgia to walk in and pretty much dominate um, Missouri from day one, or from the first minute to the last minute of the game. Um, on paper, Georgia is everything that Missouri isn't. And I think Georgia expected to walk in and pretty much dominate, but that is not what ended up happening. Um, Georgia barely got by in that game, winning the game 26-22. And they did not look like the college football team that we have seen at other times in this year even. And they definitely didn't look as good as last year. um Missouri was just better prepared to take on Georgia than Georgia was um to take on Missouri, and that's just putting it very simply. um Missouri came into that game knowing that they were a strong underdog, and that they would have to fight for every last yard that they would get, and they came in prepared to do that. Georgia was not prepared to see a Missouri team come in and compete at all. So when Georgia traveled to Missouri, they just expected to walk in, score 40 points and walk out, basically, I think is what they expected. And it's not what happened at all, not even close. I mean, Missouri's defense created a lot of pressure on Stetson Bennett. Um, Even if they weren't getting sacks or forcing him out of the pocket, they were still pressuring him into quick throws that were not entirely all that accurate. And Stetson Bennett is a good quarterback. He is a quality quarterback. He's one of the top quarterbacks in the country, and still he was being forced into making poorly managed and timed throws on receivers that didn't seem to be entirely ready. Um, there were there was a big problem with several dropped passes in critical moments. I there was a couple of times where on like a third down or a time where Georgia really needed to pick up the pace, where Stetson Bennett would throw a ball and the receiver would just drop it. It might have been a little behind, but it was very catchable, um, for any semi decent receiver to catch, and that's a big issue. If you can't if you can't catch the ball, you're not going to be able to move the offense, and we saw that a lot in this Georgia Missouri game. So Stetson Bennett um, didn't have a great game either. He was a little over half. I think he was somewhere around 55 to 60% completions. He went 24 for 43 completion to attempt, and he passed for 312 yards. So he's throwing the ball 43 times in that game and getting 300 yards, and that looks decent on paper, but he's only completing the ball 24 times for that many yards, and it's not a great he has no touchdowns. So he's getting all those yards, 312 yards for no touchdowns, with 24 completions. For a quarterback like Stetson Bennett, who's used to getting at least 2 to 3 touchdowns a game, that's a hard blow. I mean, that is a terrible game for him. Georgia's lucky that their rushing attack could pick up the pace on could pick up the pace on scoring that their passing couldn't. They rushed for 169 yards and 35 attempts, with 2 touchdowns. So when you look at it, when you look at it, the only reason Georgia won this game was because of their rushing. They really, it looked up until the last few minutes of the game in a late fourth quarter push. It really looked like Missouri was going to upset Georgia, which Missouri has never beaten Georgia at home. Not a single time has Missouri ever beaten Georgia at home. So one of the things that I saw people starting to bring up in, you know, in college football chats is, oh, it's hard to play on the road at the SEC, in the SEC. And it's and that is a complete that is something that is not true at all. It's no harder to play on the road at the SEC than it is to play on the road in the Big Ten. Missouri is not a good football team at all. It's hard to win on the road against good football teams. And Missouri is currently 2-2 with wins against programs that are not really quality programs. So when you think about it, it's much harder to win on the road at Iowa, at Minnesota, at Wisconsin than it is to win against Missouri. And for a team that has never lost to Missouri on the road, it's really crazy that they would almost lose and they were ranked in the number 1 team in the country. And I said this last week, and I'm going to say it again. This is a season that's going to, I think, by the end of the season, remind me of 2007 college football season, where there was a lot of crazy things happening. I mean, that was the year that Michigan lost to Appalachian State at home by a field goal. And that was the same year that I think 5 or 6 number 2 teams for consecutive weeks was knocked off. So for like 6 consecutive weeks, there was a different number 2 team because they just kept losing. There was no, it was a curse for number 2 teams to be ranked number 2 that season. People were joking that there was nobody in the country that wanted to be ranked at number 2, because then they would upset their season. And that proved to be quite prophetic at that time. And I'm sort of expecting, by the end of the season, there's going to be some sort of crazy stats on this season. But let's get back to the game. So Georgia trailed for the first time all season in this game. They started off the first quarter I think it was just 3-0, and then I think a few minutes into the it was either late in the first quarter or early in the second quarter. Georgia gave up a touchdown and they were trailing 10-0. Um, and that really matters because the important part of this game was not which offense could be high powered enough to score to outscore their opponent. This was really a defensive minded game. This was a game that really, in a way, reminded me of the um, Texas Alabama game in a lot of ways on how defensively focused this game was. Um, Missouri's defense looked really strong. As I said earlier, they were able to get pressure on Stetson Bennett. Georgia's defense obviously looked very strong. They did have an injury with Jalen Carter, I believe his name is, one of their top defensive players. I believe he's going to be out for a couple of weeks. And Georgia obviously got pressure on Missouri's quarterback. I think it was 3 sacks, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and it was 2 sacks. Sorry, it was 2 sacks, not 3. So it was really a defensively powered game, and Georgia should not have Missouri should not have even been close to the level that Georgia was playing at. And yet here we are, Georgia's barely winning by 4 points, 26-22. So that's all that I'm going to have to say on this game, on that game. I'm going to watch Georgia again next week. They did drop in the AP poll. They went down to number 2, and they really and they really deserve to drop down to number 2. In my opinion, I would have, if I was, in my opinion, they should have dropped down to number 3 for how poorly they played against Missouri. But the team that I want to talk about next is the current number 3 team at Ohio State. So Ohio State is my least favorite college football team in the entire college football universe. I do not like Ohio State whatsoever. I am a Michigan fan, and I will live to hate Ohio State until my dying breath. I mean, I am going to hate Ohio State forever. But I'm going to at least recognize when Ohio State plays well. And this week, Ohio State played really well against a much better Rutgers team than has been shown to us in the past. Rutgers is currently 3-2 after the loss to Ohio State. Ohio State won against Rutgers 49-10. Obviously, Ohio State is undefeated at 5-0, 2-0 in conference. And Rutgers games before Ohio State was Iowa in week 4. They lost that game 27-10. Temple in week 3, they won that game 16-14. Wagner in week 2, they won that game 66-7. And Boston College in week 1, and they won that game 22-21. Rutgers came into the Big Ten after having a lot of success. And initially, Rutgers did really poorly. Their teams were not built to handle the size and speed that the Big Ten has. Because other than the SEC, the Big Ten is the next best conference by far. And if you take Georgia and Alabama out of the Big Ten, there really isn't another super great team, at least in my opinion. Or if you take Georgia and Alabama out of the SEC, there really isn't another super great team, in my opinion. I mean, there are good teams, and there are teams that are quality, and there are programs that are quality. But in my opinion, the Big Ten has the best programs with tradition. So you have Minnesota, you have Wisconsin, you have Iowa, you have Illinois, which Illinois has not been a really good team for quite a while, and for the most part, their teams have usually been middle of the line, mid-tier teams that and they every once in a while have a very good team. But I still am under the opinion, and I do have a bias. Michigan is obviously my favorite team. I've said it before on this podcast, and I'll say it again. I'm a Michigan fan by blood. My entire family went to Michigan. So I am strongly biased in favor of Michigan, but I still think that when looking at history of programs, and when looking um at up in up north where most of the Big Ten teams are, I still think that the Big Ten holds prouder traditions than the SEC. And that's a very controversial statement. And I get that. And I'm going to get a lot of heat for it. Somebody's going to say something, but take, Georgia and Alabama out of the SEC, and you take Ohio State and Michigan, the obviously two best teams out of the Big Ten. And I think that if these conferences played each other, the Big Ten would win most of these games. That is the opinion that I hold, and I will go down with the ship continuing to believe that. But I want to talk about this game. Rutgers, the only touchdown that they scored was a muffed punt that Rutgers picked up, and then a touchdown off of that muffed punt. Rutgers doesn't get that muffed punt. Rutgers doesn't get a touchdown in this game, and I would argue that they probably wouldn't have gotten a point in this game if they didn't have that muffed punt. But Rutgers surprised me, and they looked very aggressive early on. They looked really aggressive. They came in with a lot of trick plays. They came in with an onside kick after their first points. In the first 6 plays of the game, Rutgers had 4 different players line up at QB. So it was, and throughout the rest of the game, they still switched out their QB quite often, which was surprising to me because Rutgers has a player that played quarterback for them last year, Vedral. Vedral actually had to miss the first 4 games because of an injury in the offseason. And it seemed like Rutgers wasn't really sure who the starting quarterback was. And they switched out their backups, and they even put in a tight end at quarterback at one point. And I think that was a run play. But Vedral whenever he was in the game, more often than not, he was just tucking the ball and running. Um, and it proved fairly effective. Um, I think that I truly think that JJ McCarthy, who's Michigan's quarterback, could learn a thing or two from Vedral, because he didn't wait in the pocket for 7 seconds for something to open up when there was nothing there. Once he went through his progressions and there was nobody open, he just tucked the ball and ran. And Ohio State initially had some struggles getting to Vedral and stopping him. Um, Although as the game went on, Ohio State showed very good depth at just about every position, um, which pains me to say, but you know, as of right now, they look like the best college football team in the Big Ten. Um, and I know Michigan is currently ranked number one, and Ohio State is ranked right behind them, but they still look like the best college football team in the country, and they looked big and strong and really, really fast in this game. Although their O line although Ohio State's O line seemed to struggle a little bit against the Rutgers defense. Now, the Rutgers defense was blitzing quite often, and they Rutgers proved that you could get to the quarterback in this game. That this offensive line was not a unbeatable monster of a line, that you could get past this offensive line and sack the quarterback. And even if you didn't sack the quarterback, you could still get enough pressure on the quarterback to force a bad throw and force an incompletion, or to force him to get outside the pocket and throw the ball. And CJ Stroud is one of the best outside of the pocket throwers. He has one of the best completion percentages. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but he's a very good on the run thrower. But it seems like, even though he's a great thrower, and obviously once he gets outside the pocket, he's also a great thrower. Ohio State was really, really led today by their run game, or on Saturday by the run game. Mayan Williams was the starter this year, or this week. Trayvon Henderson, I believe, was out with an injury. He did suit up in the game, but I think that they kept him off just to give him another week and see what Mayan Williams could do in this game. And the answer to the question, what can Mayan Williams do, is a lot. He can do a lot. He can run. He can run for 189 yards with a 9-yard average and a 75-yard long. And he can carry the ball 21 times in a game. And he can score 5 touchdowns in a game. So if you're looking at the question of who do you have as your starting running back now, once Trayvon Henderson comes back, the question I have is, how do you choose? How do you choose? Because Mayan Williams was asked to carry the brunt of the game, and he did the same thing the previous week, and he exceeded my expectations. And I didn't think that Ohio State was actually going to run the ball that much. I was really surprised that they ran the ball as much as they did. And they ran the ball 34 times for about 250 yards, which for a team that I have always thought of as an almost air raid team is really balanced. CJ Stroud threw the ball 22 times and he completed it 13 times for only 154 yards. Now he had two touchdowns and he threw an interception. But on the season, CJ Stroud's stats are really phenomenal. I mean, it might not have seemed like it from this game. But CJ Stroud is one of the best passers in college football, and that's why he's replaced and that's why he's replaced Bryce Young as the number one Heisman contender. CJ Stroud currently has 1,376 yards passing on the season so far, and he has 18 passing touchdowns with 2 interceptions. Now, a decent quarterback wants usually like a 3-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio. CJ Stroud's is currently 9-to-1, and if he can keep that up, he can prove that he's extremely accurate. And I would not be surprised if CJ Stroud ends up looking as a contender for the number 1 overall draft pick. Maybe not this year, but next year. I don't know if he's going to stay at Ohio State at the end of the season. But, you know, it's up to him. But he's looking like a number 1 draft prospect, which is quite interesting to say the least. So Mayan Williams is the next player that I want to talk about. He's currently the rushing leader over at Ohio State. He has 64 attempts for 497 yards, 8 rushing touchdowns, and he has 26 receiving yards. So he's not the it doesn't seem like he's the most versatile running back. He's not a hugely receiving running back, but he is fast. He's strong, and he can make guys miss pretty easily. So Travion Henderson, who has been out with injury, is the next top rusher with 318 yards and 3 touchdowns. So he'll probably be back next week, this upcoming week. And it'll be interesting to see how Ohio State chooses to play this game with them. So the next players that I want to talk about are the next 3 top receivers for Ohio State. Emeka Egbuka. So Emeka Egbuka, and I could be totally butchering that name, and so sorry to him if I am. But he has 512 receiving yards on the season so far, and he has 1 rushing touchdown and 5 receiving touchdowns. He is the same player that muffed the punt on for Ohio State that led to a score by Rutgers. And he did something weird on that punt where he turned his back to the punter, which you aren't really supposed to do. And it there was a lot of wind in that game, so it would be understandable if the wind carried the ball more than he thought it would, and he just ended up having to run backwards. Um, but a lot of special teams returners are always taught, like, don't turn your back because bad things tend to happen when you do. Um, and a bad thing did indeed happen where he muffed the punt and Rutgers players were right there to recover it, and they did, and they scored on the following drive. So it was really weird to see that. And he did it again too. That same quarter. He did it again where he just turned his back and started running to try and catch the ball. And I'm like, is there not a lesson learned here to not try and catch the ball where your back is turned to where it's coming from? Because it's hard to see the ball when your head is turned. Um, but yeah, no, it was really odd to see him do that. So Marvin Harrison Jr. is the next top receiver with 405 yards on the season, and he has 6 receiving touchdowns. And then Cade Stover uh, finalizes the list with 200 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Um, it really seems like Ohio State is. It really seems like Ohio State is building itself back up to um, beat Michigan again this year. I shouldn't say again, to beat Michigan. Um, I remember after there was a lot of press after Michigan beat Ohio State, and it was Jim Harbaugh said in a press conference something along the lines of some people are born on third and they think they've hit a home run. In when he in reference to um, Ryan Day inherited a great team from Urban Meyer, and Jim Harbaugh is just saying that Ryan Day is not as good of a coach, which is amusing to hear because even though even when after Urban Meyer left and Ryan Day continued, he still beat Jim Harbaugh, I think twice. It was either 2 or 3 times. I can't remember exactly when Urban Meyer um, retired, but it's quite interesting because the only game that Ryan Day has lost was that Michigan game, or the only um, regular season game that that Ryan Day has lost was that Michigan game last season. And other than that, I think he has 26 wins under his belt. Um, 26 or like 36 or something like that. It's either 2 or 3 seasons worth of wins under his belt. So it's quite interesting. It was quite amusing to see Harbaugh say that. And part of me thinks Harbaugh didn't think he was going to stick around long enough to um, to really feel the consequences of saying something like that, because I think he thought that he was going to go to the NFL, because if you guys remember, Harbaugh was up for the Vikings position in Minnesota, and I think that he thought that position was pretty much his after the season that he had with Michigan, and he and when it came out that he was actually interviewing, and that it wasn't just I think when he realized it wasn't just a given, he came back, and that created a lot of problems for him. I mean, his offensive and defensive coordinators both left from last season. Mike McDonald went back to the NFL to his brother, um, to Jim Harbaugh's brother in Baltimore, and Josh Gaddis, in my opinion, actually took a downgrade and went to Miami, um, to play for to play at the U. Um, I mean, it really looked bad for Jim Harbaugh, and it still looks bad because Jim Harbaugh's recruiting class is not as good so far as it usually is at this point. I mean, usually at this point, it's within the top 15 recruiting classes in the country, and usually at the end of the season, it's usually within the top 10, um, top 10, top 15. I mean, I think last year Michigan's recruiting class was number 14. So it's saying something when Michigan's recruiting class is close to 30 this year. I think it says that the recruits are looking at this and saying, saying, is Jim Harbaugh actually going to be staying in Michigan, um, at Michigan, and if he doesn't, who are they going to have to replace? And a lot of college kids don't want to go to a school with that much uncertainty when they have to look at their future. If you're a 5-star or a 4-star prospect coming out of just coming out of high school, and you're looking at where you want to go to college, and possibly have the best chance to play in the NFL, a team where the head coach just tried to leave is not a great place to go. But it seems that Jim Harbaugh didn't think he was going to have um the repercussions that he ended up having. So moving on, obviously Michigan won against Iowa 27-10, or sorry, 27-14. Um, it should have really been 27-7, but Iowa got a last like 10-second touchdown. So it didn't really matter, but it was just something that I looked at it. So obviously Iowa's a tough program to go in and win, especially for a top 5 team. And now in the past 5 times a top 5 team has played in Kinnick Stadium, Iowa has won 3 of them and lost 2. So other things going on in college football. A few weeks ago, Scott Frost lost his job at Nebraska. If the Nebraska athletic director would have waited like 3 more weeks, I think they would have, instead of paying, I think they paid him like $7 million to buy out his contract. I think they would have only had to pay $3 million. So that was not a great business decision by the athletic director at Nebraska, but it's their money. If they want to, if they want to throw it away, all the power to them. So, Carl Dorrell lost his job at Colorado, which is not surprising considering that Colorado is currently 0-5. They have looked very bad, and Colorado is the same school that that Joel Klatt quarterbacked at, who's currently Joe Klatt is currently a college football analyst and announcer and broadcaster over on Fox. He's one of my favorite broadcasters. I think he has really phenomenal takes um, on most college football big ticket items. I think that his takes are really balanced. I think in the end, he's proven right far more often than he has proven wrong. So he actually just started. He also recently started a college football podcast this season. It's over on college football on Fox, I think is the channel. Go check him out. It's really a great podcast. He talks about everything that we talk about here and more. And he has the entirety of Fox Sports behind him to get him all the numbers and ratings and rankings and everything like that. So go check him out. But it's not surprising that Colorado decided to fire Karl Dorrell. He has not been doing a good job at Colorado. So that is not in the least bit surprising to me. What was surprising and what I am pretty much baffled by is Wisconsin. Wisconsin fired Paul Chryst. So Paul Chryst walked into the weekend, to my knowledge, not knowing that his job was on the line. And he walked into the weekend with 67 wins in his tenure at Wisconsin. That is the third most in the program's history. So he has a record. He has a record at Wisconsin of 67 wins and 26 losses. That's a 72% win percentage. If it in my opinion, it is a dark day in college football where you can get sacked for having a 72% winning percentage. And it baffles my mind that they fired him. Granted, it seems that he seems to be going in a downward trend, but just because he didn't win everything you want him to win last year doesn't mean he's a bad coach, and it doesn't mean that he couldn't have recovered. Out of his first four seasons, he won at least 10 games. 10 games in his first four seasons, and he's getting sacked, I think, in year 6 or 7 or something like that. So to say that Paul Chryst is a bad coach is not remotely true at all. He won 9 games last year, and the games that he lost were very understandable losing games. I mean, I believe Wisconsin lost to both Michigan and Ohio State. Michigan goes on to win the Big Ten championship and go to the college football playoff. And Ohio State was a quality team in its own right. Paul Chryst has 3 Big Ten West titles. He doesn't have a Big Ten championship title, but he gets you to the game. There are not a lot of really good coaches that can replace him. And I think what happened was boosters and recruits and NIL sponsors were looking at this, and they were saying there is a young defensive coordinator named Jim Leonhard who has been at Wisconsin for 7 years. He's 39 years old, and he looks to be a pretty great defensive genius. And I think that a lot of it was the administration at Wisconsin was feeling pressure by people who could either help or hurt the Wisconsin program. to change out the coaching staff at the head coaching staff. And I think a lot of them wanted Jim Leonard to to succeed Paul Christ. And this is what I've heard from people who are closer to the Wisconsin program than I am. They're people who have much more of an ear to the ground than I do. And so Paul Christ will go from being the defensive coordinator this season to the interim head coach. This is going to have to be a prove it time for Leonard. It was still baffling to me that Paul Christ was fired in favor of Jim Leonard. I mean, it was really hard to see, because a coach that is that successful should never be fired. Unless he's having multiple like 7-win, 8-win or 7-win, 8-win seasons, he shouldn't be fired, especially at a program like Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin's a decent program, and they have a long tradition of being a good program. They don't have a long tradition of being a great program, in my opinion, and especially in the past 10 years, they've been good most years. But I mean, when you're talking about a conference that has really been dominated by Ohio State, it's hard to see another great program in the entire Big Ten. But I still question the Wisconsin administration's decision to fire Paul Christ, because when you're looking at a 72% winning percentage coach, you can't find many guys to replace him. And if Jim Leonard is gonna end up being better, then all the power to him and good luck. I hope he does well. I have no ill will wished upon him. But I think that he is still a little young to be the head coach of the Wisconsin program. And I think Christ was fired way too early. Now, Scott Frost, I want to talk about this a little bit, because this happened like right at the beginning of when I was starting this podcast. Scott Frost was fired at Nebraska. Totally understandable. Last year he had a really bad season, and his season this year was not looking any better. He lost to a Northwestern team that is not at its peak performance. It's just not. It's an okay Northwestern team, but it's mediocre. It's in the mediocre tier. It is not in the good tier of college football teams. And they played that game over in Ireland, and Scott Frost lost on a neutral site game. And it wasn't embarrassing, but it was disheartening, because I really thought that Scott Frost finally had the tools to. I thought they really had the tools and the players to win around 9 games this season, and I really thought that he could have turned it around and in a couple of years even possibly competed for a Big Ten title. And it was really sad to see him just see him kind of flounder at it. But I think Nebraska was it was right to fire him and the experiment that was known as Scott Frost. So that is it for today. That is all that I have for you guys. Check back in next week, Wednesday at 11. And I will see you guys next time.